A Harvard study published last year found something that should stop every American cold. Patients who visited emergency rooms after those hospitals were acquired by private equity firms died at a rate 13.4% higher than patients at comparable hospitals. 7 additional deaths for every 10,000 visits. Not because the diseases changed, not because the patients changed, because the people running the emergency room changed. The new owners were not doctors. They were investment firms that had borrowed billions to buy the companies staffing those ERs, and they needed that money back fast. We are going to show you exactly how they built the machine that extracted it, who paid the price, and the 3 things you need to know before your next medical emergency. If you have walked into an emergency room recently, you probably assumed the physician treating you worked for a hospital committed to your care. You assumed the person controlling staffing levels, shift lengths, and billing codes had a medical degree and answered to medicine. That is an illusion. The reality is that 2 massive investment firms, Blackstone and KKR, control emergency staffing at roughly 1 in 4 American ERs. They did not build these companies from the ground up. They spent 2 decades buying out every physician-owned group they could find, replacing democratic medical partnerships with a financial model designed to squeeze every possible dollar out of the moment you are most vulnerable. And when Congress tried to stop the most damaging part of that model, these firms spent $75 million in secret money to kill the legislation. The 2 firms are not obscure. Blackstone is the largest alternative asset manager on Earth. KKR manages over $500 billion in assets. These are the same organizations that built fortunes by buying companies, loading them with debt, and selling them for a profit before the consequences arrived. That strategy worked on retail chains and newspaper groups. Applied to the place Americans go when they are having a heart attack, the consequences were different. And the story of how emergency medicine became their target starts in a place most people would never expect. Emergency medicine was once run like a democracy. Physicians formed cooperative groups where every doctor was an equal partner, shared profits, and voted on clinical decisions. These were not corporations. They were medical guilds where the person treating the patient was also the person controlling how that patient was treated. The first crack appeared in 1972, when a company called EmCare was founded in Dallas to staff an emergency room on a contract basis. In 1979, Team Health was founded by a physician in Knoxville, Tennessee. Both companies began as doctor-led operations. The decisive turn came in 1996, when a former president of the American College of Emergency Physicians sold EmCare to an outside corporation for $38 million. 3 years later, Team Health was sold to a private equity firm for $335 million. Most Americans never noticed. The names on the hospital door stayed the same. The ownership behind them had fundamentally changed. What made emergency medicine such an irresistible target was a federal law passed in 1986 called EMTALA. That law required every Medicare hospital with an emergency department to screen and stabilize every patient who arrived, regardless of ability to pay. EMTALA was morally necessary, but it also guaranteed demand that could never disappear. People having strokes do not comparison shop for emergency rooms. Private equity recognized that emergency medicine had a captive customer base that legally could not walk away, and they moved methodically. By 2016, Blackstone had purchased Team Health for $6.1 billion. Envision Healthcare, rebuilt from the remnants of EmCare, merged with a surgical company to create a $15 billion entity that joined the S&P 500. Then, on June 11, 2018, KKR announced the acquisition that defined the era, $9.9 billion for Envision. KKR put up $3.5 billion of its own money and loaded the remaining $7 billion in debt directly onto Envision itself. The company being purchased was forced to carry the debt used to buy it. From that moment, every ER staffed by Envision existed under pressure to generate enough cash to service loans it never asked for. The billing scheme that made this work had a name. On Wall Street, they called it a license to print money. Here is how it worked. A private equity firm wins the contract to staff a hospital's emergency department. That hospital is in your insurance network. You arrive during a medical crisis because emergencies do not come with scheduling windows. A doctor treats you. That doctor works for the PE-backed staffing company, and that company has deliberately kept its physicians out of your insurance network. When the bill arrives weeks later, it is not for your in-network cost sharing. It is for the gap between what your insurer paid and what the staffing company decided to charge. And what they decided to charge was extraordinary. A 2016 Yale University study using hard billing records exposed the full mechanics. After EmCare took over a hospital, out-of-network billing rates jumped by 81 to 90 percentage points. Charges increased 96%. Patients were 43% more likely to be billed under the highest acuity code, the most expensive category in the system. Court filings from United Healthcare revealed Envision charged an average of 975% of Medicare rates, nearly 10 times what the federal government pays for identical services. At one Rhode Island hospital, the highest level emergency billing code cost $467 before EmCare arrived. After the takeover, that same code cost $1,649. Individual bills told the same story. One man in San Diego received a $153,000 bill for a rattlesnake bite, including $83,000 for antivenom. A Texas patient was billed $108,000 after a heart attack at a hospital with out-of-network physicians he had no power to choose. By 2017, 1 in 6 insured Americans had received a surprise medical bill after a hospital visit. The staffing companies did not need every patient to pay in full. They needed enough pressure from the threat of debt collection to extract revenue sufficient to service the leveraged buyout on the other end. But here is what separates what happened inside these emergency departments from ordinary corporate greed. While billing patients at 10 times Medicare rates, these companies were simultaneously cutting the number of doctors in the room. The Harvard study found ER salary expenditures dropped 18% after private equity acquisition. Full-time hospital employees fell nearly 12%. Sepsis patient transfers to other facilities surged 36% as critically ill patients were moved out of understaffed units. A separate 2023 study published in JAMA found hospital-acquired infections rose 25%, patient falls increased 27%, and physical hospital assets fell by 24% within 2 years of purchase, an average of $28 million stripped per facility in equipment, technology, and infrastructure. Physicians at affected hospitals describe performing chest compressions on patients who had been waiting in hallways for 15 hours. Patient volumes per doctor doubled in some locations. This was not mismanagement. This was the business model performing exactly as the financial model required. Then the whole structure collapsed, and the cost landed on the patients. When Congress passed the No Surprises Act in December 2020, banning balance billing for emergency services, with an effective date of January 2022, the financial logic sustaining these leverage empires began to fail. Envision cited $180 million in lost revenue in the first year alone. Its earnings fell from $1 billion in 2020 to $250 million 2 years later, a 75% collapse. On May 15, 2023, Envision filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy with $7.7 billion in debt. KKR's equity investment was wiped out. The firm moved on to its next portfolio. The emergency room stayed open and kept seeing patients. But the most brutal chapter in this story was not Envision. It was a smaller PE-backed firm called American Physician Partners. On July 17, 2023, that company announced it would cease all operations in 14 days. 153 emergency departments across 18 states had 2 weeks' notice. Over 2,500 clinicians were not paid for shifts they had already worked. The company refused to fund tail malpractice insurance, leaving thousands of doctors personally liable for future lawsuits from patients they had already treated. The bankruptcy plan projected a 3% recovery for unsecured creditors. The investors had already received their distributions. The patients in those emergency departments that summer had no way of knowing any of it. There is one more detail the firms hoped would stay buried in SEC filings. In roughly 33 states, the corporate practice of medicine doctrine prohibits business corporations from employing physicians directly. Private equity got around this through a structure as simple as it was deceptive. They created a management services organization that the PE firm owned outright. That entity contracted with a professional medical corporation nominally controlled by a single physician, chosen by the PE firm, who served as the legal face of physician ownership. In practice, a management services agreement routed virtually all profit back to the corporate parent. Both Team Health and Envision acknowledged in their own SEC disclosures that this arrangement operated on, in their words, questionable legal ground. When the American Academy of Emergency Medicine sued Envision in California challenging this structure, Envision did not fight the case. It exited California entirely. So what do you do with this information? The same thing you do when any critical industry gets captured by financial engineers. You stop being a passive consumer and start being an informed one. The first thing to understand is that federal law is now on your side. Under the No Surprises Act, effective January 2022, you cannot be balance billed beyond your in-network cost sharing for any emergency service, regardless of who the treating physician is or whose network they belong to. If a surprise bill arrives after an emergency room visit, do not pay it without question. Request an itemized bill. Ask your insurer to reprocess it under No Surprises Act protections. If they resist, file a complaint with your state insurance department or the federal No Surprises help desk. The system still produces wrongful bills. Most patients pay them. You do not have to. The second thing to understand is that not every emergency room has been captured. 40% of American emergency departments are still staffed by independent physician partnerships. 34% are staffed by health systems directly. Organizations like Vituity, a 100% physician-owned partnership operating 450 locations and serving 8 million patients a year, prove the physician-controlled model still works at scale. No private equity, no outside debt. Every physician an equal owner. That model exists across the country. It is worth knowing whether your nearest emergency department operates that way before a crisis makes the choice for you. The third thing to understand is that this fight is not over. The same firms that profited from surprise billing are now using the No Surprises Act's own arbitration process to extract above-market payments, and all 10 of the top filers in that system are private equity affiliated. States including California, Oregon, and Massachusetts have passed laws to close the shell company loopholes. The Federal Trade Commission filed its first antitrust case targeting a PE healthcare roll-up in 2023. A bipartisan Senate investigation released in January 2025 documented the harms across 162 pages. The regulatory response is real. It is also slow. Public awareness moves faster. 7 additional deaths per 10,000 emergency room visits. That number is peer-reviewed, published in one of the most respected medical journals in the world, and it is a direct consequence of applying the leverage buyout playbook to the one institution in American life where patients cannot walk away. Know your rights under the No Surprises Act. Know who staffs your emergency room before you need it, and know that the physicians fighting to take medicine back from Wall Street are doing it one contract, one lawsuit, and one state law at a time. If this story matters to you, hit subscribe. The investigations that most need to be seen are exactly the ones the industry is hoping you never find.